Right now, the United States is entering a 7-day stretch where 3 completely different weather threats are stacking across the same map at the same time. Not one storm system that moves through, dumps some rain, and disappears. 3 separate threats. A heat dome refusing to release its grip on the south and southern plains, repeated thunderstorms reloading across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, with some areas potentially getting hit over and over again. And hundreds of miles away from the fires themselves, wildfire smoke is drifting into cities that may have no fire anywhere nearby. Individually, none of those stories would be especially unusual for August. But when heat, storms, flooding, fire danger, and smoke begin reinforcing the same larger weather pattern, the forecast starts looking very different. And there is one part of this setup that matters more than almost everything else you're about to hear. Because if that one feature weakens, this entire pattern can begin falling apart. But if it holds, the heat stays locked in, storms keep reloading, and the smoke and fire threat can continue spreading into new areas. So I'm going to take you through this week, step by step, region by region, and show you exactly where each threat fits into the bigger picture. Because depending on whether you're in Texas, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Oklahoma, Minnesota, or somewhere in the West, you are dealing with a completely different version of the same pattern. And by the end, you'll know exactly what meteorologists are watching to determine whether this week simply stays active or becomes significantly more dangerous. Let's start with the big picture, because once you understand the shape of this setup, everything else starts making sense. Imagine a huge ridge of high pressure sitting over the south-central United States, like a lid that refuses to move. That ridge is suppressing clouds, trapping heat near the surface, and helping keep the southern plains and southeast locked into a prolonged stretch of dangerous temperatures. Now move north toward the boundary between that hot air and cooler air trying to push in from Canada. That boundary is where the atmosphere becomes much more unstable, and that instability is helping thunderstorms repeatedly develop across the Midwest and Ohio Valley. Then look farther west, where heat, dryness, and wind are creating dangerous fire conditions across a large part of the country. Fires in the northwest are producing smoke that can be lifted high into the atmosphere and carried enormous distances by upper-level winds. That means the same broad atmospheric pattern is producing completely different consequences depending on where you live. Heat on one side, storms and flooding along the boundary, fire danger and smoke farther west and downwind, 3 threats, but one larger atmospheric setup connecting them. And that is the key to understanding why this forecast can look worse every time you check it. Let's start with the heat, because this is the most persistent piece of the entire pattern. Across the south central and southeast United States, dangerous heat is not behaving like a normal one-day summer spike. Instead, the ridge is allowing heat to build, hold, and expand across a large portion of the country. Temperatures across the southern plains and Gulf region are expected to reach the upper 90s and low hundreds repeatedly. But the thermometer isn't telling the whole story. Humidity is adding another layer of stress, pushing heat index values substantially higher than the actual air temperature. And that distinction matters because the human body does not experience temperature and humidity separately. When moisture is already filling the air, sweat evaporates less efficiently, which makes it harder for the body to cool itself. That's why a temperature that looks merely hot on a forecast can become dangerous once the humidity climbs. And the bigger concern here isn't simply how hot one afternoon becomes, it's how long the heat refuses to leave. A single afternoon at 100 degrees is one thing. Several consecutive days of extreme heat, followed by nights that don't cool enough, create a completely different level of stress. Earlier in this pattern, parts of the Southwest were already experiencing extreme heat, with Phoenix pushing above 110 degrees and Las Vegas seeing consecutive record highs. That heat didn't simply vanish after the records were broken. Instead, the broader pattern expanded eastward toward the southern plains, Mississippi Valley, and southeast. And that is why this week deserves attention even in places that aren't usually associated with the most extreme desert heat. The dangerous part of a persistent heat dome is that it can keep adding new territory while maintaining the heat over places already affected. And unlike a tornado or hurricane, extreme heat doesn't always look dangerous from outside. There may be blue skies, sunshine, and barely a cloud overhead. But underneath that calm appearance, the human body can be accumulating heat stress hour after hour. Heat also tends to hit the most vulnerable people hardest. Elderly people, young children, outdoor workers, people without reliable air conditioning, and anyone spending long periods outside can be affected much faster than they expect. So if you're in Dallas, Oklahoma City, Houston, Memphis, Atlanta, or anywhere across the broader southern heat zone, this is not a forecast you want to treat as just another hot August week. Plan outdoor activity around the coolest parts of the day, stay hydrated before you become thirsty, and take heat warnings seriously even when the sky looks completely harmless. But while the South is dealing with persistent heat, the story changes dramatically once you move north. Because along the northern edge of that heat dome, something very different is happening. Cooler air is trying to push south while warm, humid air is pushing north. And where those air masses meet, thunderstorms can repeatedly develop. The important word here is repeatedly. This isn't necessarily one dramatic storm system that arrives, causes damage, and moves away. The more concerning setup is when storms develop along the same corridor again and again. That can happen when the larger scale steering pattern remains slow enough for multiple rounds of storms to affect the same general region. The Storm Prediction Center has been highlighting severe weather potential across parts of the Midwest and Northern Tier, with damaging straight-line winds and large hail among the primary concerns. An isolated tornado can also remain possible within stronger storm clusters, depending on the exact ingredients present when those storms form. But here's something important. A risk category on a forecast map does not mean every location inside that area will experience severe weather. It means the atmospheric ingredients are present for potentially dangerous storms to develop, and the details can change considerably as forecasters get closer to the event. That's especially important for the Midwest because storm timing can determine almost everything. A cluster that develops during the afternoon can behave very differently from one that forms overnight. And storms that repeatedly track over the same region create another problem that can become even more serious than the initial severe weather threat. Rain begins accumulating. The ground becomes saturated. Then another round arrives. Then another. And suddenly, what looked like several ordinary summer thunderstorms becomes a flooding problem. That's why the heavy rain threat across parts of the Midwest and Ohio Valley deserves just as much attention as the severe weather threat. Imagine an area receiving a strong downpour on Monday, then another on Monday night, then another around Tuesday. The danger isn't necessarily one storm producing an extraordinary amount of rain. The danger is that the ground gradually loses its ability to absorb what keeps falling from the sky. And once that happens, water begins moving across roads into low-lying areas and toward streams and creeks much faster. This is particularly important across parts of the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians, where terrain can funnel water rapidly downhill. In eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, narrow valleys, hollows, and creeks can respond surprisingly quickly when heavy rain falls repeatedly across already saturated ground. So if you're in Louisville, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, or communities farther south into the Appalachian terrain, don't focus only on whether a tornado warning appears. Pay attention to rainfall totals, flash flood warnings, and the condition of the ground around you. Never assume a flooded road is safe simply because the water doesn't look very deep. Moving water can hide damage underneath the surface, and a road that appears intact may not be intact at all. Now here's where the forecast gets even more interesting. Because while all of this is happening in the Midwest and Ohio Valley, another story is unfolding hundreds of miles away. Wildfire smoke is moving through the atmosphere and reaching areas far from the fires that produced it. If you're in parts of the Midwest or Great Lakes and you look outside to see an unusually hazy sky despite having no nearby wildfire, that smoke may have traveled an enormous distance before reaching you. Fires across the Northwest can inject smoke high into the atmosphere, where upper-level winds can transport it across multiple states. Eventually, some of that smoke mixes downward toward the surface, affecting air quality far away from the original fire. That is why a city can have no fire danger nearby and still experience unhealthy air. And the same ingredients driving the broader heat story are also contributing to elevated fire danger across portions of the West. Hot temperatures, dry vegetation, low humidity, and stronger winds can allow an existing fire to spread rapidly or make new ignitions much harder to control. So the West has a different problem from the Midwest. Instead of worrying primarily about repeated thunderstorms, people in parts of Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada are dealing with elevated fire danger and the possibility of worsening smoke. And if you're downwind of those fires, your main concern may not be flames at all. It may be the air you're breathing. That's why checking local air quality conditions matters even when there is no wildfire anywhere close to your neighborhood. People with respiratory conditions, children, older adults, and anyone particularly sensitive to polluted air can be affected more quickly when smoke concentrations rise. Now step back for a moment because this is where the three stories finally connect. The heat, storms, and smoke aren't simply three unrelated disasters that happen to occur during the same week. The larger atmospheric pattern is helping create the conditions for all three. The persistent ridge is keeping large areas of the South hot and dry while also helping maintain the broader pattern across the western United States. Meanwhile, the boundary around that ridge becomes a focus for instability and repeated storms farther north. And the same hot, dry background conditions are helping maintain elevated fire danger in parts of the West. One pattern, three expressions, and your location determines which one you experience. If you're in Texas, the problem is heat. If you're in Chicago or Indianapolis, the problem may be repeated thunderstorms and flooding. If you're in Pittsburgh or the Appalachian region, repeated heavy rain becomes especially important because of the terrain. And if you're in Minneapolis, Milwaukee, or parts of the Great Lakes, you may have to watch both storm development and the air quality situation. Now let's put this into a timeline, because the next several days are where the story starts becoming easier to follow. Through the immediate period, the South remains locked under the heat, while storms continue developing along the boundary farther north. That means the country doesn't get one clean break where the weather resets. Instead, different regions remain under different threats at the same time. As the weekend progresses, the heat remains the most consistent signal across the South and Southern plains. Meanwhile, repeated thunderstorms can continue affecting parts of the Midwest and Ohio Valley, with heavy rainfall becoming increasingly important wherever storms track over the same areas. Then, Monday becomes one of the most important points in the forecast. A corridor stretching from northern Illinois toward western Pennsylvania is currently a key area of concern for organized severe thunderstorms. That corridor includes major population centers such as Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. The reason this region stands out is the combination of warm, humid air at the surface, stronger winds higher in the atmosphere, and a boundary capable of focusing storms. If those ingredients overlap at the right time, storms can become organized enough to produce widespread damaging winds. But there is still uncertainty, because what happens Sunday night can influence what happens Monday afternoon. Overnight storms can leave behind clouds, cooler air, and outflow boundaries that change where the atmosphere becomes most unstable the following day. If the atmosphere clears and destabilizes efficiently, Monday's storm potential could increase. If clouds and cooler air linger, the severe threat could be weaker or shifted into another area. That uncertainty is exactly why the forecast should be treated as an evolving situation rather than a guaranteed outcome. After Monday, the focus shifts again toward repeated rain across the Ohio Valley and Appalachians, while the southern heat continues building. By Tuesday and Wednesday, the combination of saturated ground and additional storms could keep localized flooding concerns alive, even if the severe weather threat becomes less organized. At the same time, the South could be dealing with heat index values well above 100 degrees, with some locations potentially reaching the 105 to 115 degree range. And that brings us back to the most important question of the entire forecast. What happens to the ridge? If that ridge weakens and breaks down, the heat can finally begin to ease. The storm track can shift, and the entire stacked pattern can start unwinding. But if the ridge holds firm or strengthens, the same basic setup can continue producing heat in the south, storms along its northern edge, and persistent dryness and fire danger farther west. That's the variable meteorologists are watching most closely, because it determines whether this week is simply an active stretch of August weather or the beginning of a longer-lasting pattern. So here's the practical version. If you're in the South, prepare for prolonged heat rather than one bad afternoon. If you're in the Midwest or Ohio Valley, watch both severe storms and cumulative rainfall. And if you're downwind of western fires, monitor air quality even when there is no nearby fire. 3 threats are sharing one map, but they will not affect everyone equally, and the forecast can still change as the atmosphere reveals more of its hand. The important thing is to watch the pattern, not just one headline: heat in the South, repeated storms along the boundary, smoke moving far beyond the fires, and one stubborn ridge determining what happens next. Subscribe to know more proof and stay with us as that ridge either breaks down or refuses to let go.